Good evening, dear audience. Geopolitical TV welcomes you, and we would like to represent Professor Walt Richmond, who is specialized in researching Caucasus, nations, tribes, languages, geography, traditions. And we're gonna start from today series of TV show about all indigenous nations and cultures that are existent in the Caucasus region. So I would like to represent Professor Walt Richmond, who also is an author of two books about Circassian ancestry, heritage, and culture, and the destiny of this nation. And from today, we're gonna open our show series representing you Circassian nation, and then during the next upcoming shows, we're going to represent each Caucasian tribes and nations separately. So, welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. Well, the first thing to do would be to explain exactly who the Circassians are. They probably are descendants of a culture that came from central Turkey around 2000, maybe 3000 BC, called the Hattians. And they were driven out of Turkey, what is now Turkey, into the North Caucasus at the time of the Hittite invasion. So they've been in the North Caucasus around 4,000 years at least. Once there, they split up into four distinct groups over time. The Abkhazians and the Abazas, very closely related. The Circassians, who call themselves the Adigas, and a small group called the Ubyks, who were somewhere between the Abkhazians and the Circassians. We're not terribly sure because they no longer exist. The group that I've mostly focused on were the Circassians themselves, although I know a bit about the Abazas and Ubyks as well. The Circassians and all of the people here speak a language that seems to be unrelated to any other language. It's called a language isolate. The Adiga Abkhaz languages don't seem to have any close relatives. And it's a very interesting language. It has over 80 consonants, I believe, and very few vowel sounds. So it's a very interesting sounding language and unusual sounding. The Circassian people, as I said, that I focused on the most, are also interesting in that at one point they were by far the largest ethnic group, the largest nation in the North Caucasus. And at this point in time, they are not the largest, they are not the smallest by any means, but they are significantly less in number in the North Caucasus than they were in, say, 1775. Currently, there's 750,000 Circassians, including the Adigas and the largest tribe, the Kabardians, who speak a slightly different language. Whereas there were well over 2 million, maybe even more, Circassians in the 1700s into the 1800s. And that is the kind of the puzzle of the Circassian people, what happened to them. And many people don't really know what happened to them. They were subjected to Russian colonization, and the Russians' colonization drastically interfered with their ability to drive their cattle and their sheep, and it began a war. And the war began in 1763, and it continued until 1864, which ended in what the Circassians refer to as the Circassian Genocide, when the vast majority, well over 95% of them, were driven very horribly out of their homeland onto the coast of the Black Sea, where many, many of them died, and then were sent by ship over to Turkey, where once they were in Turkey, many, many more died as well from disease, starvation, and the stress of everything they'd undergone. So the few that remained continue to try to repopulate under heavy pressure from the Russians, and they've only been able to achieve a small fraction of their population even in the 1830s. After the war had been going on for many decades, there were still more Circassians in 1830 than there are now currently in 2015. So that's one of the questions I investigated in my second book, is exactly what happened during this period of time when the Circassians were placed under this horrible pressure by the Russians, which resulted in their almost total destruction as a native tribe in the Caucasus.
So, according to the tragedy and history of Circassians, so they have been displaced from their original homeland to Turkey, and then have been from there they have been spread it all around the world.
Yes, that's in fact not all of them were sent originally to Turkey. Many of them were sent into Bulgaria to really to Islamicize that area because they were. Some of them were forced to convert to Islam when they immigrated to the or driven out to the Ottoman Empire. Some of them had already converted, but it was partially strategic to get Turkey's help. And the ones that were sent to Bulgaria, after they'd settled there in 1877-78, the Russians drove them out yet again during the war with the Ottomans, and they ended up in refugee camps in Istanbul and were sent on into Syria, into Jordan. There are actually a couple of Circassian villages in Israel as well, and they continue to disperse there in virtually every country in the world. The majority are concentrated in Turkey, but the diaspora goes all over the place.
You mentioned a very interesting thing that I would like to ask another question.
Certainly.
Yeah, the questions are upcoming.
Mm-hmm.
So, according to the existing information, most Circassians are Muslims. The Russian media is showing that Circassians are extremely radical Muslims. Is that correct or no? And if it's possible, can you more expose the religion attitude, like the religion variety existing? I know that Abkhazians also they have even pagan style of worshipping. They have Christian worshipping that related to Abkhazians. That's the information I'm carrying, and some of them are Muslims. So we would like to know more about it.
Initially, they had their own pagan, would be called pagan religion. Many, particularly in Kabardia, converted to Christianity to make friends with the Russians because many of them saw the Russians as a large neighbor that they had to make peace with, and so they converted to Christianity. And that's why you see very frequently the Russian name Cherkessov, and those of a Circassian would take that name as his last name when he would convert to Christianity. The ones further west, closer you get to the Black Sea, the more Muslims you find, but it really wasn't anything more than a strategic conversion. Now, it's true, there were some who became devout Muslims and practiced Islam devoutly, but primarily it was because that was one of the terms the Ottomans imposed upon them to receive help. And so there were even stories of Christian Circassian villages who would take down the cross and put up the crescent, and then when the Turks would leave, they'd take that back down and put the cross back up. So they were really not very devout in any way. What they always have followed, and to this very day, is their own code of behavior called Adiga Habza. And Adiga Habza is far more important to their lives than anything to do with religion. It's a very, very complex code of behavior. One day, I was asked an older Circassian gentleman to tell me every time I violated Adiga Habza, and it was constant. Virtually everything I did was a violation because their code of behavior is so regimented, a very highly organized code of behavior. And that to them is their, not religion, but that's their way of life. I have never heard really of radical Islamic Circassians. The ones who are in Syria are not radical at all. Some of them are very devout Muslims, but they're not radicalized at all. The ones in Jordan, as a result of essentially founding the city of Amman, became very rich. A Circassian actually founded the Jordan National Bank.
Yeah.
And so they're far more interested in business than anything else. And so they're very business oriented. Many of the Syrian Circassians who immigrated to the United States when the Golan Heights were taken, unfortunately for them, they had established their kind of capital in exile in the Golan Heights and lost it. Some of them who were the original batch who came over still practice Islam. Some of them have completely integrated into American society, business people, and their children are completely integrated into American society. So I think it's a grave mistake to claim that Circassians, as a group, are extremist Muslims.
So the media intention more than the truth.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Circassians have a nationalist movement that the Russian government really doesn't like, and it's much easier to vilify them if they portray it as a religious extremist movement rather than a nationalist movement to reclaim their homeland. So that's a lot of what's going on.
Actually, the nationalism cannot rise up itself. The chauvinism is provoking nationalism. Nationalism cannot come up itself like from nowhere.
No.
The chauvinism exists, the nationalists rise up. So there is no chauvinism, there cannot be any type of nationalism. There is one question I would like to ask. So as you mentioned, they are coming from Hatti civilization.
Yes.
So, and that civilization have been generated in how today's the Western world or the media call Anatolia, or as we call Armenian highlands.
Yes, yes.
So in our legends, also in Armenian legends, we have that from Armenian highlands dispersed all tribes of the world. So can it be somehow related to that?
Well, my colleague John Colarusso has a theory which probably could never be tested, that the Circassian language is distantly related to a very old form of the Indo-European language group, archaic and ancient forms of Indo-European. The very fact that the two groups come from the same general area indicates they're related in some way. And so it would not surprise me at all if we were to do some genetic tests and find out that the two groups are related far back.
The thing is that in Armenian language, Abask or Abask means the nation of the hand.
And that's, the flag, yeah.
Yeah, Abask means the hand.
Yeah.
Az means nations.
Yeah.
Nation of the hand. So, and when I asked Abask why you have this this hand on your flag, they did different. They say different things, but nobody could say that this means that. And so, as I understand, we were neighbors on the Black Sea shore with them, Armenians, and the tragical moment is that Circassians and Armenians are dispersed all over the world in almost same percentage proportion. Like about 15-20% are remaining on their motherland. The rest are spread it all around the world, as well as Armenians.
Yeah.
So, and our auditorium do not know that much. So, all this information that we're exposing gonna go further and further.
Yeah.
And one more question. As I understood that the Circassian culture did a big influence on the Vaynaq and Georgian nation. Like, as we know, the most nations of the living in the Caucasus are very proud to wear Circassian men's suit, the Circassia, and the tradition of carrying Circassian way weapons, and the different variations of Adige Khabze in each nation has carrying. And so this is a very great civilization. How the Circassian culture is exposed in the neighbors' culture? Like, we know that the Cossacks also are carrying some of their heritage.
Absolutely.
Their dresses, the way they walk, the way they look, their pride, etc., etc.
Well, Circassia was much larger than you would imagine. It actually extended right to the border of Chechnya. And so the Vaynaq peoples and the Circassians were trading partners all the time. There was the clear trading all the way over into what is now Azerbaijan by these peoples. And the Circassians were the largest group by far, much larger than any other ethnic group in the North Caucasus. They were also, some very fascinating things about this culture. For example, they would carve their saddles this frame for the saddle out of a solid piece of wood. And the reason for that is a normal saddle is made with hinges.
Yes.
And so when you ride the horse, you can hear it. But if it's a solid piece of wood, it's absolutely silent. And so they could ride through the woods in silence. And another thing they did, you see these, and all the different peoples, the Georgians as well as the Vaynaks, those little...
Gizzers.
Yeah.
We call him, it's, by the way, it's from the Turkish word of hazır.
Yeah.
It's ready.
Yeah, the readies, that's what the Circassians called them. And they were waxed
Yes.
rounds, and the Circassians would train to pull them out and reload their guns with their teeth while they were riding the horse. And so they were incredibly impressive warriors. One story I heard, this was a Russian who said he was riding with this, and Circassians came up. The Circassian jumped off his horse, ran up to one of the Russians, stabbed him, ran back, and jumped back onto his horse and took off, which is just incredible. And so I think they were just very impressive people, and the Cossacks saw this, and as well as everyone else, and they certainly they were all interested in warfare at the time. And so they adopted the ways of the Circassians because they could see that they were very effective and very well thought out.
Also, we saw maps that the bigger Circassia had borders with Crimea.
Yes, yes. all the way
So they were also trade partners or economic or political. I am pretty sure they're going to be political partners too with the Crimea too. I mean, the Crimean Tatars or the Greeks prior to Tatars.
They had some trouble. They had a troubled relationship with the Crimeans because the Crimeans, especially when they began to work with the Ottomans, would raid the western tribes of the Circassians. And so one of the largest tribes at the beginning of this period, say in the 1500s, were the Janais. But because of the Crimean aggression, the Janais are gone. They simply migrated eastward and merged primarily with the Shapsug tribes and the Natukhais further east. The Crimeans were very aggressive in Circassia, and they did have some alliances, but it was more the Crimeans imposing conditions upon the Circassians. And so it was a very uneasy relationship between the two for a very long time. But they definitely had, it's a very interesting story. There's a monograph written on it that covers it in great detail, and it's very complicated and not a stable relationship, but certainly they had a lot of relations with the Crimean Tatars. Yes.
There is a city in Ukraine, the name is Cherkasy.
Yes.
And there is another city in Rostov region, the name is Novocherkassk. Is it somehow related to Circassians?
You know, I've read stories about how those cities got their names, and I don't remember them right off the top of my head, but they are definitely related because the Circassians, although you can draw the borders of Circassia, they would go far beyond those borders when they would take their herds, because that's just the nature of pastoralism. You go many, many hundreds of miles. And so they went well up into what is now central Ukraine and back. This is one of their big gripes with the Russians, was that as Russians moved further south, it inhibited them from feeding their livestock. And it caused famines, and that was one of the first things that started the war. Was a famine broke out that the Circassians blamed the Russians on, because they were not able to. The Russians had established borders, and they were not able to follow their traditional routes. And this is unfortunately a common thing in colonialism. The same thing happened in sub-Saharan Africa, where the Africans had certain migratory routes, and when the Europeans imposed borders, it caused a great deal of economic harm. Same thing happened in Circassia, a great amount of economic harm, and that is really what triggered the war, was this disruption of their ability to move freely with their herds.
Some of Iranian scholars see that all these problems related to Circassian, Lesgians, Avars, and to all indigenous nations of the Caucasus started from the Turkmenchai Treaty, when prior to coming to the region of the Russian Empire, there were two empires, Turkish and Persian, that were competing, and they were balancing each other.
Yes.
Then the third player came up, and there is a vision that after the Persians left the Caucasus, the peace also left with them. has this theory some logical explanation?
Well, I'll tell you what I know the most about it, and that is when Russia and the Ottomans decided they would draw a boundary between their two empires. And they drew the boundary right through the middle of Circassia, which didn't claim allegiance to either side. And the Russians started guarding the border. And this was the major disruption. And shortly after that, a group of Circassian princes approached the Russians and said, "You're disrupting our way of life." So all three of these powers, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, fighting over the Caucasus, would arbitrarily place borders that caused conflict. And I don't know I know what the Treaty of Turkmenchai was, but I don't know too much about the ramifications of it. But wouldn't surprise me at all that kind of treaty is what caused certain problems.
We have been under the Persian, Armenians on the east have been under the Persian influence, and Armenians on the west have been under the Ottoman influence. And we know the differences of their way, how they were dealing with the colonized nations. And the Persian Empire was more tolerant.
Yeah.
And they were considering the local traditions. It was more considerable under the Persian influence than under the Ottoman influence.
Yeah.
And let's call the Turkish influence and the Russian influence were almost equal.
Well, that's the same.
In tolerance, in the tolerance percentage, let's call it that way.
Well, that's the same thing I see in Circassia. They had no Persian influence. It was Russian on one side and Turkish on the other. On the Turkish side, the Ottomans sent over missionaries to convert sometimes forcibly the population to Islam, and it didn't work very well until the war escalated and they needed help. On the Russian side, the Russians tried to convert them to Christianity, but more than that, they tried to destroy aspects of that cultural code, Adik-Habza, that interfered with them. For example, one very important aspect of Adik-Habza is the notion of hospitality. Someone comes to your door, you don't ask what he wants, why he's there, who he is, you let him in and treat him as a member of the family. Well, the Russians didn't like this because someone was running from them, and they would go to a Circassian's house, and they would refuse to turn them over to the Russians. Sometimes deserting Russian soldiers would do this. In one instance, General Yermolov destroyed an entire village because the villagers would rather have their village destroyed than turn over a guest, because the entire nation would shun them if they did that. It was so sacred a thing. So that was one thing they tried to destroy. Another was their tradition of sending sons to neighboring villages and sometimes neighboring nations. And it was a way of building some form of solidarity. Your son is a Circassian, but he was raised by Ossetians. And that created a solidarity. And that, of course, the Russians' theory was divide and conquer. And so they tried to disrupt that as well. So the Russians' influence was primarily destructive, whereas the Ottomans tried to convert them to Islam. They were not nearly as destructive of the cultural heritage as the Russians were. They had their own moments of aggression when they would send armies in and try to forcibly convert the people. But the Russians really were more comprehensive in their attempt to destroy Circassian culture and heritage.
I have read Turkish historians that were mentioning that they needed Circassians because the Black Sea and the communication with the Crimea, not every time and every season of the year the Turkey could supply Crimea. So they wanted also a landline to Crimea. So they wanted to build solidar nations on the Black Sea shore so they could send cavalry, goods, economy, trade.
Well, that was part of it, definitely. The Circassians had lived in a very strategic location. That was one of their downfalls. They lived in a very strategic point. And the Turks wanted that coast for trade purposes, but there was also this propaganda, ideological thing. They wanted to turn the Black Sea into an inland lake that the Turks, Ottomans would have control of all the shores just for the sake of, pride, ideology. It was, that was a big part of it, that the entire Black Sea would be an inland lake, an Ottoman lake, essentially.
Yes.
And so the Ottomans were very determined to do that. and the Russians were very determined to keep them out. And the four Circassians were caught right in the middle of this, and they were not in a position militarily to do much about it except fight as they did to the very end.
So their location determined their way of life.
Definitely. This is one of the reasons they became such a warlike people, because they had to be. For hundreds of years, they were constantly under attack from every side, and they just adopted a very martial attitude. By the time the Russians got to them, they've been compared to the Spartans in their martial way of life. So,
but I don't. Have there been any big temples or culture, like architectural big buildings, or everything has been destroyed? I don't see like big architectural any creations in the area.
no, because they were constantly under attack, they didn't build anything that would last because it was always being destroyed. They lived in communities called, the word in Circassian is owl, and it's often translated as village, but it's more like community because the villages constantly had to move from when under attack. And they would line canyons, gorges, up sides of mountains. When the Russians started coming in, they moved higher and higher into the mountains where the cannons couldn't get to them. And they just never had a chance to really develop a unified culture or a unified government. They had a culture. The only building they really built was their Mejlis, or their parliament in Sochi, which was their one and only capital. But as soon as they built it, the Russians came and burned it down. So,
yeah, this also I see the similarity between Hamshen culture. So the more the Turkish came to the east, so the more the Hamshis went to the mountains.
yes, yeah, and the Circassians more and more joined the Shapsug tribe because they controlled the highest mountains. Until by the end of the war, the Shapsugs were probably 80% of the entire Circassian nation because everyone had joined them to stand up to the Russians.
I would like to ask another question. There is a very big intention showing Circassian participation in Armenian Genocide. That is done by the Turkish government, that is done by the Russian government, and there are like a lot of parties that are showing that Circassians especially killed Armenians, that the Circassians almost voluntarily ran from their motherland, came to Turkey, and just joined to Turkish military just to kill Armenians and then to go somewhere else. So unbelievable stories. And my great-grandfather was fighting Circassians. He caught a couple of them, and I heard that stories that there were a lot of Kurds, Circassians, Chechens, Arabs participating in the Ottoman army. And we fought them. We were fighting as well as there were, I'm pretty sure there were Armenians fighting in Russian army. So what could you say about this intention showing Circassians are barbarian tribes, murderers, killers? And even the Turks, when we are asking why you killed this much Armenians, they say, no, we are very peaceful people. These were the Circassians serving in Turkish army showed excessive force.
Yeah.
We didn't give them such orders.
Well, that's an easy excuse, but the majority of the Circassians lived in central Anatolia, and they stayed as far away from anything civilized as possible because they were afraid of the Russians coming and getting them again. What happened was this. The Ottomans made no provisions for these people. So when hundreds of thousands of Circassians appeared on the shores of the Ottoman Empire, they had no food, they had no jobs, they had no place to live. And in order to survive, many of them just formed into bands, and they became bandits. And I read in a correspondence from them, one of the British consulates in Istanbul, saying they were put in a position of either starve or rob. And quite unsurprisingly, they chose to rob. And these are the bands who ended up homeless. And I could easily see the Ottoman government saying, look, these people here, they're Russian allies. And they're fighting on the side of the Russians, and the Russians are coming. People uneducated, illiterate probably. I could see them very easily being duped into fighting like that because of their experience with the Russians already. And so the ones who fought The Circassians were in fact a very martial people, but I could see very easily them being convinced that the Armenians were some kind of Russian agents or threats,
Yes,
and the
of
ones who
course.
did participated based on that kind of information. But I also know of a Circassian who said his father hid Armenians from the Turks during the genocide.
Yes.
And so you can't
I
generalize.
I know a
people like
lot
that.
of Circassian families in Syria that gave shelters for hundreds of thousands Armenians in Syria, especially in the areas of Hamishli,
Yeah,
Latakia, up to the
Right.
Iraqi border.
because they knew what it was like. They knew what being run out of your homeland is like.
The thing is that more and more is coming another information that there was some kind of agreement between Russian government and Turkish government of the population displacement.
There was, in fact, an attempt to make an agreement in the 1800s that the Russians would move the Circassians to the Ottoman Empire and the Ottomans would move the Armenians to Russia. And my kind of informal theory is when the Turks saw what the Russians did to the Circassians, which was wipe them out, drive them to the coast, and drive them to the Ottoman Empire, and the Western powers turned a blind eye to it. They simply, during the war, they tried to back the Circassians, but for their own reasons. It was all
Oh
them.
yeah, I have read this.
Yeah, all for their own reasons. But as soon as it was over and the Circassians were of no use to them anymore, they simply turned their back on them. And my belief is that this new Turkish government, with that horrible triumvirate, they said, look, the Russians did this to the Circassians, nobody cared. We can do the same thing to the Armenians. And so they simply did the same, started off with basically ethnic cleansing, which turned into genocide. And I think the two events are very closely
And
related.
then in 1930s, Hitler said nothing happened to Armenia.
Yeah, and clearly there's a connection between all three.
And now ISIS is doing nothing happened to them.
Exactly. No one pays any attention to these things happening. And this is the connection with the Circassian genocide, which everyone has forgotten, that it seems to be like one of the inspirations for the Armenian genocide among the Turkish government, and it has become an awful scourge in the 20th and 21st century.
Now a little bit, we came from history, but I would like to ask a couple of questions in the political manner.
Okay.
Look, as we see, our genocide became a bargaining tool. So what I always try to prevent this as an Armenian, because this is our tragedy. This is not something to buy and sell. But today's modern day politics, so will there be any intention to make a bargaining tool to Circassia genocide issue? As you see in last tensions between Russia and Turkey, suddenly Turkey remembered about genocide. Suddenly.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure this is done on purpose, of course.
Of course.
So
it could. The problem with the Circassians is they're a smaller nation than the Armenians. And so their diaspora just doesn't have the voice that the Armenian diaspora has and can't get the kind of attention. And the best example of that is the Sochi Olympics, where they really tried their hardest to draw the world's attention to the fact that Sochi is a Circassian word, that it was the first capital of Circassia, the only capital of Circassia, and that was one of the deportation points, that right where the Olympics were being played was where one of the last battles was fought in the war.
yes.
And so literally where these people were celebrating was where Circassians were dying of starvation 150 years earlier. Literally 150 years, because it was 2014, and then the genocide happened in 1864. So it was a 150th anniversary. So they got very little traction there because they're such a small group. And disorganized there. They never gelled into a nation before their deportation. The way the Armenians have a sense of a single nation, they didn't have that yet. And so they still have tribal competitions between themselves. And they can't, and now they unlike the Armenians, the Armenians in Bulgaria feel kinship with Armenians in America, the Circassians in Syria they become Syrianized. The Circassians in Europe are becoming Europeanized, and they're losing their kinship with one another. and they don't have a common vision for what's going to happen. So as far as politics, I'm very pessimistic at where the Circassians are going in the future. I'm sorry to say that, but I'm very pessimistic about it.
I think they're going to have bright future if they rely on their own muscles.
Yeah.
And they start up building their muscles, their national schools, or some forms of school or educational centers.
Right.
Because if you don't educate your kids the way they should be educated, somebody else gonna get them and educate the way he wants.
And that's exactly what Russia is doing right now. They eliminated their language, Adagabza, from this curriculum as a requirement in the Circassian republics, and made it an elective to downgrade it. And
Of
so
course.
the idea is to eliminate that language. And the ones in diaspora have a horrible time. In Turkey, there were signs in villages, speaking Circassian is forbidden. A friend of mine in Turkey said he was beaten severely in grade school for speaking Circassian to a friend, just
Yes.
whispering Circassian to a friend.
That's almost a felony.
Yes, yeah.
Almost a felony.
And they beat him, the teacher beat him in front of the entire class. And the ones in America, for example, in New Jersey, there is a gentleman who's trying to teach the children their language, but 1 hour a week. You can't learn a language, especially a
course.
complicated language like Adagabza, in an hour a week. And so it's a real uphill struggle to keep that language alive. The best hope is that the ones in Russia can keep it going, because they are fluent in it, and although it's being taken out of the schools, they still
And they have
change it.
ground under their feet.
Yeah, they do. Exactly. And so I think they're the best hope for the future of the Circassian nation, is the ones who are living currently in Russia, in the Circassian republics.
Yeah, in their motherland.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, of course, because as we say in Caucasus, your soul is giving you forces.
Yes.
When you're living at home, you're more stronger.
Oh, the Circassians believe that the land contains the bones, the flesh of their ancestors, and they get power from that. The power of their nation comes from the land itself, because that's where all their ancestors actually are, in that land.
There is an Armenian legend about the land. The Armenian king was showing very loyal, high-level loyalty to Persian king, but the Persian king called his monks, that was during the pagan times,
Yeah.
and asked them how I can check him, how far he is loyal to me. They say, put on the half of your yard Armenian soil, on another half leave the Persian soil,
Yeah.
and walk with him and speak.
Yeah.
So he did that, and he called the Armenian king, and they start walking in his backyard, talking together. Wherever the Armenian king was on the Armenian soil, he was talking very rude,
Yeah.
very honored, very
Yeah.
proud. Whenever he was coming to stepping on the Persian soil, he was very flexible,
Oh, yeah.
stepping back. So this is the way the Persians proved how Armenians were loyal. So these legends are based on truth. I mean,
Yeah.
these are, maybe this never happened, but this is showing us,
Oh, yeah, they tell stories, absolutely. They teach
teaching
lessons.
us
Yeah.
how to love your own soil.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think today's show was informative, and really I learned a lot today.
Thank you.
I hope our audience also now has a big load of information, and they can check these, read,
Yeah,
understand the issue, and
I hope so.
I would like to thank Professor Walt Richmond. I hope this is not the last time he's coming to our studio, and he will
Sure.
be very common guest here. And till next Thursday. Next Thursday we speak about Eastern Caucasus, about Caucasian Albania, what happened to it, what type of civilization was that. So we discuss together again as today. And you can call us, you have our phone numbers. Any questions, please follow us on geopolitical.tv.